This is a bonus episode of our conversation with Dan McClellen, Bible scholar, and you only get it for being a part of the Pastor Paul support community. If you're enjoying being a part of this community, make sure and let people know to join with you. You can ask me questions every day on the community chat board, and I will answer. You can interact with me on a regular basis. Get into the Zoom room in some of our special events we have coming up. All of that through the Pastor Paul support community. So keep checking in often on the community chat board and encourage and invite friends to come and help support us as we continue to spread the message that God is not mad at you.
I get a lot of the monotheism, polytheism thing. I get a lot of questions about how text became canon. There is this idea that a bunch of men sat around a table and had all the texts out there and just went through and said, okay, you're in, ooh, not you, and just kind of picked through and said, these are in and these are out. And that's not really how the process went down. It serves a lot of people's personal interests to imagine these powerful institutions saying, we want to control everybody. So these texts make it difficult, so we're going to get rid of them. These texts make it easy for us to control people. And it's easy to kind of reduce and simplify to that because it allows us to hold up the institutions as the villain, as the bad guy. It's a lot more complex than that. It's a lot messier than that.
And then on the other side of that coin, I just thought it floated down from heaven in a leather binding, and this is it. This is the Bible. I didn't even realize people thought Enoch should be in there somewhere. The Bible is to be taken literal. I'm sure this is a question you get a lot. And how much is allegorical? And my daughter went off to a liberal arts university with a Christian backing, and all of a sudden she's calling me and she's like, "Dad, do you know every religion has a Noah's Ark story?" So yeah, how much is literal and real, and how much is allegory, and how do we sort of determine that?
It's difficult. I think there are.
By the way, somebody's asking a question about Adam and Eve, and so are they real? Are they literal? Or are they allegorical?
Well, with Adam and Eve specifically, I would suggest that. Let me start with Ugarit because I can tie this in. So Ugarit was this city that existed from about 1500 BCE to about 1200 BCE. And they spoke a language very closely related to Hebrew, but they used an alphabet that derived from cuneiform, not from Phoenician. And we have a bunch of texts from them, and we have a bunch of mythology. And a lot of it is very, very closely related to the Hebrew Bible. In fact, there are some things that are like in Isaiah 27:1. This is a direct quote from an old Ugaritic text. But we have scribes wrote on colophons. They labeled their texts, written by, and there was one scribe named Ilumilku, who was probably one of the most prolific scribes at Ugarit. But we have different versions of the same mythological tropes written by this scribe. And they are very different, and they tell the stories differently, and the characters do different things. And so this is a religious tradition where they are kind of openly changing things up, and these different versions of these texts are in circulation. And so from there, we move to two different creation accounts. And one of them seems to be correcting another one. Like Genesis 2 and 3, you've got this deity who walks in the garden in the cool evening breeze, who shapes the human out of clay, who makes this human and then is like, we need something more. Okay, we're gonna make all these animals. This isn't right. This isn't good. Okay, now we're gonna make the woman. Okay, you've got a partner. Okay, don't do this. Dang it, they went and did that. Okay, we got to get rid of them. And this deity is constantly trying to fix their creation. And then in Genesis 1, this likely comes much later. And this is a deity that does not create with their hands, but creates by divine fiat. And it's not the creation of the
So wait,
earth.
let me stop you there. So you're saying Genesis One is a correction of Genesis 2 and 3, which is a copy of a story that was written outside the Hebrew culture.
Well, Genesis 2 and 3, I would suggest were not copied from, but they are pulling from this similar source. They're breathing the same air, basically. And so, we had Armageddon and Deep Impact came out at about the same time. I don't know if you remember those two movies, but did that seem like somebody screwed up somewhere. And they weren't copying off each other. It was just they came up with these ideas, and they happen to be very, very parallel because they're working within the same social matrix. So there are definitely parts that are responding to some of these other traditions that are out there. They're not just saying, "Oh, here's a tradition. I make this." They are writing so as to say they did it wrong, we're doing it right, but there's still, some parallels. And so Genesis 1 comes through, and rather than the deity making the earth and then the heavens, it switches the creation of the heavens and the earth. The deity creates by divine fiat. You've got this special verb, bara, which is only ever used of divine creation, rather than asa, which just is the generic word for do or make. And then what happens after every creative period? And he saw that it was good. Don't need to fix this time. And so it is a way to update and correct the creation account. And the fact that they're back to back is probably a result of them just being archived together. Somebody probably just stored them on the same scroll, or maybe on two scrolls together that were later copied onto one scroll. But they were probably never intended to be read one after the other. But they probably were used, in Genesis 2 at least, was probably used in, or at least I think so. A lot of scholars think it's likely. Some scholars don't think it's so likely, as part of a New Year's festival where they would dramatize or reenact the creation of the world in an effort to kind of reinscribe creative acts and power so that the cycle of the next year would successfully be fulfilled. Genesis 1, likely written in exile or in the post-exilic period, you have no temple. So the story kind of describes the creation of the earth as a temple. And so we're now expanding the sacred precinct. And so our Judahites in exile can feel like, we still have a temple of sorts here. And then where they don't have the ability to go into the Holy of Holies and offer sacrifices, they set apart, instead of having sacred objects and sacred space, they set apart sacred time.
Sorry, my dog is joining.
Our dog just never decided it wasn't going to be a barker. So
gotcha.
He very rarely barks. Genesis 1, you don't have the temple, you don't have the sacred space. And so what do they set apart? Sacred time. 6 days rested on the seventh day, set that day apart. And so now the Judahites who are in exile may not have the sacred space, but we can treat this day as sacred, and we can do what we do to worship on this day. And so I think there are a bunch of ways to look at these creation accounts as serving particular functions, addressing specific needs within these different contexts. And yeah, they're drawing from what's around them, but they're not just pulling it wholesale into their text. They're responding to it. They're correcting it. They're probably getting rid of stuff over here. They're probably bringing in new stuff here. But there's a great book by a scholar named David Carr, and called The Formation of Genesis 1 through 11. And what he talks about is the precursors to the traditions in Genesis 1 through 11. And so it's talking about the Tower of Babel. This is probably kind of making fun of this ziggurat that was being built outside of Babylon, that construction stalled on it, and it just sat there unfinished for like 70 years. And so they're probably making fun of these folks by saying, oh, we're going to build this grand tower, and then, oh, your languages are all screwed up now, you can't finish, and then just wander around and leave it alone. And that's what, oh shoot, I forget the name of the ziggurat. It's got a peculiar name, but
Interesting.
and so now, oh, well, that must be what that tower over there is that they never finished.
Tower of Babel. Now I hear from from people often that even the story of Jesus has been stolen from other cultures, and that Jesus doesn't have a proof of history and other historical text. How do you respond to those ideas?
Well, there are two parts of this, I think, because there's this mythicist idea that the Christ tradition was just invented out of whole cloth, which doesn't really fit with the historical methodologies, because we have texts that we pretty confidently believe date to within 2 decades of the death of Christ. And these are Paul's letters, at least the genuine letters, are probably written, 20, 25 years after the death of Christ. And so it gets difficult to argue that this person was just making this all up. And the Christian tradition is growing fast enough that already by around that same time period, we have Christians in Rome causing trouble. And we have, by the end of the first century, Christianity is pretty widespread. So given the rapidness of that growth, given that we believe Paul's genuine letters come from an early time period, the probability of this all just being made up is phenomenally unlikely, which is why the vast majority of historians, of scholars of the Bible, of religion, of history, just accept there was a historical person named Jesus who was likely executed by the Romans. Hey, my water bottle must be in there. But there's another part of the story, and that is the kind of Horus idea that there are all these other deities from ancient Egypt and elsewhere that were born on December 25th and that were born of a virgin and that had 12 disciples and got baptized in this river and died and then resurrected 3 days later. And this all comes from Enlightenment era scholarship that was basically trying to find, the grand unifying theory of all of this. And so there was a lot of parallelomania. There was a lot of drawing links where links didn't really exist. And some of the less responsible scholars started seeing patterns where no patterns exist. And so we had some scholars in the 1700s, in the 1800s, who really invented the notion that all these things in the Christ tradition are found in these ancient Egyptian texts. And I've spent years trying to track down any potential parallels. What ancient texts might these have come from? And there is nothing. And every time that someone brings this up, I challenge them, show me an ancient text. And what they do is they quote these books that are self-published from 10 or 15 years ago that give a text and say, this means all of this. But anybody who knows that text and can go engage with it knows it has absolutely nothing to do with that. And so that's the question that shuts them all down. Show me the ancient text. And then they're scrambling for some kind of rhetorical deflection because none of them can find these ancient texts. So the preponderance of evidence supports the existence of a historical figure named Jesus, at the very least. The notion that
whether he was deity or not, right?
Right. The notion that this was all stolen from Egyptian deities is pure and utter nonsense. There are no data that support that.
That's great. And do you feel any discomfort that there should be, if Jesus was such a significant character, we should see more of him in Roman writings?
I don't think so, because that period is not, and that region is not phenomenally well attested in any records. Like Josephus is pretty much our best source for that era. We found some scattered inscriptions here and there and a handful of records. And some people refer obliquely to what's going on out here. But Josephus is really the best we have for that region, for that time period. And so I think that's an artificial standard. The expectation that, we would have found the receipts for the executioner and we would have found all these other records of them having crucified somebody named Jesus, and that's pushing the historical methodologies way too far.
And Jesus was a pretty common name at that time, or Yeshua was a pretty common name, right?
Yeah.
So it'd be kind of around. Question I have too, and you may have some thought on this, and you may not, but it's actually kind of coming from a book you recommended in one of your TikToks of the Bible with and without Jesus, is how in the Gospels it's written that Jesus took the Judaic text and then sort of reinterpreted it with you've heard it said, but I say, or you've heard it said from times of old, but I say. Is it fair how Jesus did that, or the writers of the Gospels did that, or are we denigrating Judaism by doing that, I guess, is the big broad sweeping question of it all.
That's an interesting question. I think there were a lot of debates about the law and what the texts mean back then. And, if you look in rabbinic literature, that's a lot of what's going on. Rabbi so-and-so said this, but Rabbi so-and-so said that. And so there was a lot of debate. The innovation, I think, is that Jesus doesn't base things on the text. Jesus says, you have heard that it was written, but I say, and that is all the authority he needs. Now, there are contests, there are confrontations with certain individuals who are challenging his authority, where he does not just say, because I said so, that's why. He uses some rhetorical maneuvers there to try to outsmart them. And so I think there's a degree to which it is holding up Jesus above the text. And to the degree that it is supersessionist, I think there is arguably quite a bit of supersessionism in parts of the New Testament. And so I think those are problematic. But I think
supersessionism being the blessing to the Jews has gone away and has now been given to this new set of people who follow Jesus. Is that right?
Right. That Christianity supersedes and replaces Judaism,
right.
Which is, and it's a common kind of trap for Christians to slip into. But there's a degree to which what Christ is doing is also very closely related to what other authors from this time period are doing. There's a very big transition that happens within a couple of centuries after Christ's death in the trajectory of ancient Judaism. And so the last couple of centuries before the Common Era, the first century of the Common Era, this is a period of a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different movements, a lot of different attempts to change things were going on. And you have the rabbinic trajectory takes off after Christ's death. And so I think what the authors of the New Testament are doing is not an enormous departure. It is consolidating a lot of the traditions that were in circulation, the traditions about messiahs and expectations about the future. They're consolidated in Jesus in a way that was new and innovation, and definitely an elaboration on where things have been before. But a lot of the text and a lot of the discourse is not phenomenally unusual. There's a lot of stuff that Jesus and the gospel authors say that can be found in some of the later rabbinic literature. The hermeneutic is not phenomenally unusual. It's related to some of the interpretive rules that Hillel comes up with. For instance, I think there are 7 interpretive rules. So it's breathing the same air as a lot of the other things that were going on in that time period. It was also an innovation in certain ways. And I think as the royal of those 2 or 3 or 4 centuries settled down and you had these 2 trajectories out of it, I think that's where the distinctions start to solidify. And it's in the centuries after the New Testament that Christianity as something distinct really develops. But that's an argument that's still ongoing. The parting of the ways, they call it. How did Christianity become something more than just a sect of Judaism?
I think it's important to know. And I love your explanation of it. Do you need to grab some water real quick?
No, I think I'll be okay.
Okay, we're about finished. But that, where was I going with that? It just that there's room for us to share a sacred text and be okay. It's when we get to, and I think the inerrant theology of evangelicalism, that the Bible, like you say, has one common theme that goes through the whole thread, is inerrant, all God breathed. That's when we start to get to a place that we have to be right and they have to be wrong.
Yeah.
But I think if we start to learn differently, and what you're doing so importantly, that we can give space for disagreement, but coexistence, if I can use that word, and mutual respect for one another, and be able to say, a lot of times, yes, the text could mean what you're saying it means, but it could also mean this. So we need to be able to exist together with that tension that it could go one way or the other. I think that's what's so important about what you're sharing.
I agree, and I think that's a wonderful way to put it. Is if we can maintain that tension, I think there's also additional opportunity for growth. As in my tradition, the Latter-day Saint tradition, a lot of folks see the scriptures as something dynamic, as something living. Every time we approach it, we can find new things in it. It can guide us in different ways. There's also, however, this notion that it's supposed to mean one thing. And I think it depends on how we're approaching it. If we approach it because we have a set of circumstances and we want guidance, or we want to feel inspired, or we want to commune with deity, and we allow it to be flexible, and allow, go to a Jewish service to hear how they understand things, find new ways to understand it. It can do all of that. But that doesn't serve the boundary maintenance that we also use the text for. And so when we approach the text in order to say, I'm going to prove that this is right, we freeze the text. We make it one-dimensional. And I think depending on what we're using the text for, we're going to prefer flexibility, or we're going to prefer woodenness and unidimensionality. And I would love to see the former take over, and I would love to see the latter fade away. In my tradition and on TikTok too.
Yeah. Well said. We've killed each other enough, literally and figuratively, over it that maybe it's enough. Oh, that's one question I just have to ask before we go, yeah. And I'm sorry to take all your time, but do we worship a God, and by we, I maybe mean greater Christianity, who used to tell people to bash babies' heads against the rocks? Is that our God? And somehow he had a change of heart, and he doesn't ask us to do that anymore.
No, that's one of the, I get this a lot. Folks say, I just don't like reading the Old Testament. It's depressing. It's violent. The sex is not very cool. They just don't like it. But a lot of that is, this is people who've nations have been oppressed, have been enslaved, have been, had people killed every single year, and they're lashing out. And a lot of it is propaganda. It is saying, these are our enemies right now. But I tell you what, a couple hundred years ago, yeah, we really took them to task, and we got them all. It's rhetoric, it's propaganda. It's an attempt to shore up those boundaries and to say, we're right, we're good, and we win. And they're wrong, and they're bad, and they lose. And unfortunately, it gets preserved in a way that it is deployed to justify horrific acts. And that's one of the other products of treating this as, univocal, is you got to get the bad with the good, and somehow you got to find a way to make that bad good. Yeah, and that causes problems. So yeah, I don't appreciate that approach to the text. I think we need to be able to acknowledge when something is just a writer lashing out for rhetorical purposes, and not God saying, "Blessed are those who will take their babies and smash their heads against the rocks."
And I think what that does is it gives us a chance to respect the text for what it is, to glean what's good out of it and what brings the best out of us, and the rest of it be able to say it has raw humanity in there, and that's maybe a part of what makes it special too. But like you say, we've got to be careful not to say, well, then existentially this is good if somebody wrote that God says it's good.
Yeah. I think when we let the text operate on its own terms, I think that there's a lot to learn in there, and there's a lot to make us think. When we try to mash it all together and make it all agree, all we're doing is reinscribing our own beliefs. We're just turning it into what we want it to be, rather than letting it turn us, if we are devotional readers of the text, into what it wants us to be. And sometimes I think that means recognizing when it is a fallible piece of human rhetoric.
We have Matt on YouTube asking when your book is coming out.
I reached out to my editor on the other day, and I'm waiting for a response, because the COVID has pushed a lot of things back. And so I was hoping it would be early this year, but it looks like it's probably going to be later this year. But yeah, unfortunately. But I will be letting everybody know as soon as I have more information. And I'm actually working on another book, and I can't imagine if things continue to go wrong, maybe that other one will be out first. But this other one, I'm hoping it will be more of a popular trade book, so something that will be more accessible to the kinds of folks who watch my videos on TikTok. And it'll be called God, a Biography. And I'm going to talk about all the different ways that God has been in the Bible. God has been conceptualized and represented, and what purposes those conceptualizations seem to have served. And I think there's a fascinating story to tell about the human struggle and how we can deploy conceptualizations of God to serve those struggles, whether it's crisis, whether it's boundary maintenance, whether it's structuring power, whether it's controlling people. But I'm deep into that book, and I'm excited about that. I'd love to finish that soon, but.
It sounds great. Well, everybody, there's the moniker on YouTube at McClellen. Check him out, Dan McClellen, on TikTok, and you'll learn a lot about the Bible. It's great stuff. Thank you guys for joining us for the podcast today. I'll be over on my website, pastor-paul.com, in a bit if you want to ask some questions in the community chat over there. Otherwise, we'll see you guys all again